Multiplying integers with integer chips. This is a digital lesson. Students can move the yellow and red chips around their screen in order to solve the multiplication problems. The lesson starts with explaining what integers are, and then it tells students that the red chips represent negative numbers and the yellow chips represent positive numbers. So to show 3 times 2, two positive numbers, it's just 3 groups of 2. So that's just a good visual for the students. It works the same way with negative numbers. So if I have 3 times negative 2, that's 3 groups of negative 2, which would be negative 6. So the first slide the students are going to work on, they're going to show 3 times negative 4, or 3 groups of negative 4. So in order to move the chips, they just click and hold on the chip and then move it into place. So you want 3 groups that show negative 4. That means 4 red chips in each group. So they're just going to move all of these chips into place to show that they have 3 groups of negative 4. Now to get the answer, they just have to count all of the red chips. Well, these are all negative, so our answer is going to be negative. And they should be able to count 12 negative chips. So they type in negative 12. The next slide, 4 groups of negative 2. So you can see the 4 groups here, and they're just going to put 2 chips in each of these and then count their total. Now the next slide explains to the students what happens when the first factor is a negative number. Well, we can't have a negative number of groups. So we're going to use the commutative property, and that tells us that we can multiply in any order. So if we have negative 4 times 5, we can just switch the numbers. That's the same as 5 times negative 4, or 5 groups of negative 4. So we just want to switch the numbers if that first number is negative. So they're going to do that on the next slide. They have negative 2 times 5. If they switch the numbers, 5 times negative 2, then they have 5 groups with negative 2 in each group. And they're going to show that negative 2 in each group, and then they're going to count all of the chips to get their number, which will be a negative number. Same thing on the next slide, switch the numbers so that we have 3 groups of negative 4. Now another way to look at integer multiplication is to look at the negative symbol as meaning the opposite of. So if 5 is the opposite of negative 5, then 5 times 3 is the opposite of 5 times 3, which would be negative 5 times 3. And you can see they're opposite colors. So 5 times 3 would be yellow chips. The opposite of 5 times 3 would be all red chips. So you can see the answer here would be 15, and the answer here would be negative 15. Just another way to visualize this. Now for the next slide, it says use the integer chips to show 4 times 2 and the opposite of 4 times 2. So here they're going to show either 4 groups of 2 or 2 groups of 4. And these are all going to be yellow. So they just want to move these into place. 4 groups of 2. They're using all the yellow chips here. To move some of these out of the way. Let's see, let's move this up. 4 groups of 2. Now the opposite of 4 groups of 2 is going to be the same thing, but all red chips. The next slide, we have 3 times 6. They're all going to be yellow because they're positive numbers. So 3 groups of 6 or 6 groups of 3. And then the opposite of that would all be the same thing, but all red chips. So what happens when both of the factors are negative? Well, if we can figure out what 5 times negative 3 is, so it's going to be 5 groups of negative 3, well then the opposite of 5 groups of negative 3 is going to be the opposite color, which would make it a positive 15. You might want to explain that a couple times to the students. So here they're going to show negative 4 times 4. That would be 4 groups of negative 4. The opposite of that would be all yellow chips, so the same thing but all yellow. Opposite would make it an opposite color. Now this leads to the rules for multiplying integers. So they can look back through the previous slides, see what happens when the signs are the same. If the signs are the same, your product is going to be positive, so they're going to just type in positive. When the signs are different, your answer is always going to be negative. And those are the 2 rules for multiplying integers. So once they know the rules, then they can go through this final slide and using the rules, find out all of the answers here, or all the products. So it starts out giving students 2 ways to visualize multiplying integers and then leads them to the rules. So this is a digital lesson, multiplying integers with integer chips.